Everybody, so that'll help if you're visiting with us, kind of get a feel for how we've been studying the Gospel of John. Before we begin, Tim, can I ask you if you lead us in prayer, please, Tim Payne?
Our God and Father in heaven, we're so very grateful to you for another day. We love you very much. You are our God, our Father, the only God, and the Creator of the universe. Dear Lord, please watch over us today as we study and help our minds to focus on the Word you've given, the Word written down in John. Dear Lord, help us to apply each and everything we've learned to our lives, to learn the power of your Son, that he was your Son, and you put him here on earth for us. Dear God, we're so eternally grateful for that sacrifice that he made for us, and the love that you had as a father in giving him up for us. Lord, be with Brother Chuck and help him to guide us through our thoughts today. Thank you for the lives that we have on this earth. Help us to always use each and every moment to serve you. This I pray in Jesus' holy name.
Amen. Amen. All right. Like I said, got these couple slides that a couple are going to go through them real fast this morning. Things we talked about as we've been studying the Gospel of John that separates it from the Synoptic Gospels. On in, morning. Y'all doing? My little, if it makes sense to anybody else, but the little catchphrase or a little quote there at the top is one that I'd come across a long time ago. And one of the things about the Gospel of John is it is more about who he is than what he did. And so just the idea there is, that John, and we've made this point several times in this class, is about if you handed this book, if you handed this book and it was to an unbeliever and you just handed it to him and asked him, say, what does John think about this man, Jesus? And I think you go away with a pretty powerful understanding of who he thought Jesus was. And so that's the idea there. Some of the things that are not there, the account of Jesus' birth, his baptism, no record of the temptation or the transfiguration, the appointment of the apostles, called out, institution of the Lord's Supper, the Great Commission, the parables, they're not there. Also, what is there? Water to wine, the discussion with Nicodemus, the discussion with the Samaritan woman, and then the raising of Lazarus. And we're going to we may get to that this morning, hopefully. And then, unlike some books in the Bible, John is very clear about what his theme is. In John 20, 30 through 31, it says, truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and believing you may have life in his name. So again, John clearly states, what he believed about Jesus. And so I think that's clear through the book. The sevens or the signs and the I ams, you've probably had this from other studies, is the water to wine, the healing of the official's son, the healing of the lame man at Bethesda, the feeding of the 5,000, the walking on the water, the healing the man born blind, which we're going to start off with this morning, the raising of Lazarus, the I am statements, the bread of life, I am the light of the world, I am the door, I am the good shepherd. We're going to look at that this morning. I am the resurrection and the life, which we may get to. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and then I'm the true vine. So those are the I am statements. We just got done in chapter 8 where he kind of the dividing line, right? And he kind of draws that line where he makes that statements in John 8 where he makes that I am, and they clearly understood what he was saying. And we're going to see that start to happen, or that fracture start to get wider as we get into this last part of the book. One thing I did want to remind or kind of call back, I don't have it on the slide this morning, but before we get to lesson 6, chapter 9, remember the timing here. We talked about this last week, and that fact is in John chapter 7 through 9, it talks about the Feast of the Tabernacle, which would have been that September, October, which would have been about 6 months prior to the cross. Okay, and then in chapter 10, which we'll get to in just a few moments, it talks about the Feast of Dedication in 1022, which would have been roughly November, December time frame, which would have been about 3 months before the cross. So you kind of get the idea there of what goes on. Does anybody remember a couple of things I called out about the Feast of the Tabernacle? What were a couple of the features there? Because one of them is, I think, is pretty key in what we're going to talk about in John 9 this morning. Matthew?
There's a big emphasis on water there, remembering God's provision of water for the Israelites from the rock in the wilderness. And then also, like calendar year, they've just had the dry season over the summer.
Yep.
And they're anticipating the rains in the fall.
Okay. And what was the other feature of the Feast of Tabernacles? Does anybody remember about something they put in the courtyard? Oh, go ahead. All right.
There's two great lights that they would keep lit.
Yep.
You could see them for miles and miles around.
And again, that represents back to the light in the wilderness, right? All this was a reflection. All this is just kind of memory work. We talk a lot about memory work for ourselves as Christians, and these things in this feast were just that for these Jews, right? And so they looking for that. And I think that exactly is why, I don't think it's any coincidence that we talk about the Feast of the Tabernacles and those two events, and what we're going to talk about this morning with Christ or Jesus healing the blind man. Yeah.
I didn't hear his answer.
Oh, I'm sorry. Talking about the light. There was two great lights in the temple courtyard during the Feast of Tabernacles. Two things that they did. One was the water. They'd go to the Pool of Siloam, which we're also going to see here. I should have mentioned that. The Pool of Siloam, the priest would go and get water. They would pour it over a rock to represent that idea of that God provided water for them during the wilderness wandering. And the second thing was that great light that they followed at night or had in front of them. And again, they would light these lights in the temple during that Feast of Tabernacles.
I've never heard that.
Yeah, so those two things. Yes.
This Feast of the Dedication is the only place it's talked about in the Bible, right? Or, I mean, in the New Testament.
I believe so.
It's the only gospel that mentions it.
That's a good call out. I believe you're right there. I believe that's right. And it's actually, we'll get to that in a little bit, but does anybody know the modern feast of the Jews that we refer to this as? Hanukkah. Yeah, exactly. And so we'll talk about that in just a little bit. So there's two things there. Like I said, that Feast of Tabernacle, like we talked about it last week, our lesson book kind of follows this same pattern. It does follow the same pattern. We've just been going through these and referencing and Miles makes a call out in the book, and it's at the end of the book. It talks about the hour, and there's references to the hour throughout the book. Either his hour has not yet come, or is coming, or has come. And so we're going to see that. We don't see it called out in these chapters, in chapter 9 or 10. Or did anybody find one? I'm sorry. I shouldn't have given away the answer before I asked the question, should I? That's not a good teacher, is it? But did anybody see anything that they thought referenced it? Because there are some subtle times where there's things, but I didn't have any, and I don't think Miles actually noted any in the back. But that idea, that theme, and he points that out as when he put the book together, and just that idea. But then in these other questions, we have these kind of static questions that we have each week, is what others are saying about Jesus and what Jesus says about himself. So we'll start with that first one before we get into looking at the questions. But what are others at this point? What are others saying about Jesus? Matthew?
You got some folks saying he has a demon, and other folks say he doesn't sound like a demon-possessed guy.
Yeah. You start to get those two extremes, right? As far as, and we talked about that a little bit last week. I don't know that anybody today would say Jesus is a demon, right? They may say they don't believe in him, but I don't know they'd go that far. But at this point, they were. What else do you see him being called?
The blind man, verse 17 to 9, believed he was a prophet.
Yeah, believed he was a prophet. What else? There's some that we've seen before.
His disciples call him rabbi.
Yeah, they calls rabbi or teacher. Gets called that quite a bit through the lesson.
Verse 16, they call him a sinner. They said, how can a man who is a sinner perform such signs?
And you got 10. What is that?
Chapter 9, verse 16.
Oh, chapter 9, verse 16. Yep. What else? Any others? Like I said, yeah, and he gets called that in 9. I think it also gets called that later. Yeah, verse 24. He says, verse 24, he says the same thing. So they called again the man who was blind and said to him, "Give God glory. We know that this man is a sinner." So, and why were they calling him a sinner? What was their point in healing on the Sabbath? But what else? He had made it clear already who he was. Yeah, I am. He's trying. He's putting him on that level of God, right? And so that's where he's really critical. Or they're starting to be critical of him. And they also, in that respect, they also call him at one point, I think, a blasphemer. It's over in chapter 10, verse, and we'll get to there in a little bit. But chapter 10, verse 20, it says that's where they call him a demon. But then in chapter 10, verse 33, is where he blasphemes. Making yourself a god, making yourself a god. So, all right, what is Jesus saying about himself here? Yeah.
Chapter 10, he calls himself the door of the sheep, and then in verse 11, he says, I am the good shepherd.
All right. He says he's the door. He says he's a shepherd. We're going to talk a little bit, pretty detail about that in a little bit here. What else does he say about himself?
I and my Father are one.
I and my Father are one. Yep. What else?
I'm the light of the world.
And where's that?
9:5.
9:5. What else? In chapter 10, and in that area that he's talking about him being the good shepherd and all that, I think it's a powerful what he says there. And when he talks about being the good shepherd in that 11 through 18 section there, he also talks to what he says about himself is what is he going to do? What action is he going to? What does he clearly state in that section that he's going to do?
One flock, one shepherd.
One flock, one shepherd. Thinking of something that I'll just give it away. I'm probably not asking that the greatest way, but I'm just going to. And what he makes several references in there in verse 15, verse 17, and verse 18 about he's going to lay down my life for the sheep. So it's sacrificial. I mean, he's going to lay himself down. And I'll just jump there right now since we mentioned that, because it's in one of the later questions, and I'm always afraid I'm going to have a note written down and not get to it. But when it talks about in chapter 10, when it talks about that sheepfold in that chapter, the first part of chapter 10, does anybody studied another studies you've had? Because I hadn't before, honestly, and I think when I taught this book before, I really didn't get into it. But does anybody understand or have studied before what a sheepfold is?
It's a containment area, and the shepherd actually lies down in front of the opening.
Yep.
He really is the door.
Yep, that's a great point. And the thing I read about it is actually that there was actually two types, and one of them was in a more of a village setting. In the village settings, sheepfolds would be a wall made out of rock, pretty rough area, but it would be made up. And in a village area, it might have a physical door, but in the wilderness, when they made one, it was the sheep or the shepherd would actually be the door. So he would make his tent or pitch his bedding or whatever right in front of that opening. So it'd have one opening, so the sheep would stay in there. And so he's literally the only thing separating the wilderness from the sheep was that physical shepherd. I mean, he's literally standing there in the door. And this idea of being called was that in the wilderness or in the village area, when they were herded together and they were in these sheepfolds, there might be multiple, say me and Chris were both there at the same time, and his sheep were in there and my sheep were in there. And then when we got ready to leave, I would call my sheep, and my sheep would follow me by my name, or they would hear my voice and would come to me. And then Chris's sheep, he would call his sheep, and his sheep would follow him. Now, I didn't understand this, and I wish I thought ahead. I wish I'd have done this video. But Miles and I got to go to Romania back when he graduated high school. And we got to go over there, and we were late for church one Sunday morning for the best reason I could ever think of in the world. We were heading down this country road going to this village where we were going to have services that morning, and there was a sheep herder, and the road was blocked with sheep. And so it was amazing because I'd never been around sheep before. They don't grow them in Kentucky. They don't raise them in Kentucky. So I'd never been around a sheep before in my life. But this sheep herder, and he had some dogs and he had a donkey as well. But I just remember they were walking down, and the road was paved actually. But these sheep were just everywhere. They were on the road. They were kind of pretty much together. But what was amazing to me, and it wasn't really his. He was hollering at the dogs and the sheep too, and they would kind of listen. But what was amazing to me that this sheep herder had this big staff. And what was funny, I just thought it was amazing, he would holler and he would hit that staff on that pavement. And when he'd hit that staff on that pavement, there might be a sheep that might be wandering off a little bit, you know, and we don't want to watch them for maybe 15 or 20 minutes, but the sheep would, let's say, wander off, maybe was out there, and he'd holler, and that sheep, you'd see the sheep just, you know, tuck back in. And there might be another one. And he did that several times. And I just thought that, you know, and this passage really made a lot more sense to me after I saw that. And I've got a video still on my phone. I just didn't think about it. But it was just, and they're not a good smelling animal. I'm just going to say, I just remember that. And I'll tell you a story. I don't know if anybody would know anybody from Tennessee, but there's a Dennis Ford who's an elder in the church in Tennessee. He was wearing a white shirt that morning. And they had a little cat, I guess a little ewe, I guess what they call them, the ewe. And he had, the shepherd was actually carrying it in his backpack. It was too big to go, and so he thought it was all cute, right? And so everybody, there was a couple girls with us, and they were holding a sheep and petting this little lamb. And then Dennis goes and grabs the sheep, and he was preaching that morning. Well, I guess that little lamb got excited and kind of made a mess on his shirt. And so he's wearing a white shirt. So he preached that morning with a yellow stain on his shirt. But no, I just remember that, and this just made a lot more sense to me when you see that. And they truly do know their master's name. I mean, that's just, or their shepherd's name. And so, anyways, I just wanted to get to that. I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but I just wanted to touch on that because I've always just like I said, when you see something in real life like that, it just makes the thing make more sense to you. So, anything else anybody had about what Jesus says about himself? All right, and then anything? Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
That's all right. You said that he is the Son of God. He said, the Son of Man. Do you believe in the Son of Man? And then he says, I am he.
Great.
I'm the one talking to you.
And what?
He's the one talking to you. Verse 35.
All right. Oh, in chapter 10.
No,
Oh,
not
9:35. Okay, thank you. So again, he talks about that, and he's making that distinction as far as where he is, or who he is, and what the people are saying about him. Anything else anybody had about the general questions? Because I want to go through. We'll go through some of the questions here. And again, we'll just kind of talk through these as we normally do. And again, it says, why do you think Jesus' disciples ask about the blind man and his parents' sin? Do people think like this today about people with special physical and mental circumstances? What does Jesus teach on this issue? I don't know. Is there any thoughts on that one? Do you think people still think that way today?
Absolutely, people think that.
Yeah,
today.
yeah.
Especially with poverty, you'll see people will assume that in some way it's that person's fault or maybe their parents' fault. Maybe not. In this case, with this one, Jesus says, no, it wasn't his fault. It wasn't his parents' fault.
Yeah. And what was remember in the Old Testament, what was the big issue Job's friends had, right? It was the exact same thing, wasn't it? I mean, it was Job all over, right? I mean, it's just, it's like, what that kind of thing is, and you've done something wrong, or your parents did something wrong, or something like that. Sometimes it is because, and Matthew said that, sometimes it is because of circumstances that person creates, or maybe a child is born with a certain illness or a certain circumstance because of what their parents did or took, or something they may have done prior, while they were conceived, or something like that. But then there's also just the natural thing and sin being in the world.
I've heard in India, if a woman is widowed, because her husband passed away suddenly, then they actually treat her like she's kind of a curse,
Mm.
something related to her that caused it. So they kind of ostracized by society as a result.
Yeah.
It's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
It's her fault that her husband passed away.
Yeah, that's sad. But yeah, it's amazing how much it does. People do, and even in the back of your mind, and things like that happen.
I think less of it in this country now because I think we've seen people born with birth defects. But I was going to say the same thing about India. Ryan came back from India just recently, and he's told us about the same thing. When you're born in a certain way and you have some sort of whatever your issue is, leper, whatever, it's because of something that you did. So I don't think we have as much of it here in this country because I think we think a little bit differently. But when you read this, though, this is like commonplace. Like the way they talk in chapter 9, this is just like, oh yeah, it must be because of some sort of sin. That was just like common culture right there.
Yeah. All right. And All right. What division is there in 9:16 about who Jesus is? How do the formerly blind man and his parents contribute to the problem, and what do they truly seem to believe about Jesus? And so it talks about that there. Is said, and we'll just read that a little bit. It says, therefore starting 9:16, therefore some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God because he does not keep the Sabbath. Others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. Then they said to the blind man, what do you say about him? He opened your eyes. He said, he is a prophet. But the Jews did not believe him. And then going down to what they go to his parents down in verse 23. Therefore his parents says, he is of age, ask him. So they, again, I'm sorry, let me jump, I went down too far. It's in verse 20. His parents answered them and said, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind, but by what means he now sees we do not know, or who opened his eyes we do not know. He is of age, ask him, he will speak for himself. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews, for the Jews had agreed already that if anyone confessed that he was Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. So, what was that saying about the leaders? And so what did the parents do in that respect? What was this going to do to them? Yeah, I mean, and we think about that sometimes, right? It's not just about, I think we take it as a harsh thing when, somebody's withdrawn from a congregation, right, for sin and that thing, and it's, rightfully so. But does it affect every part of their life? A lot of times it doesn't, does it? I mean, it's not as much as it would these Jews, right? These Jews, their religion and who they were as Jews, right? You can tell that no matter what you think about the Pharisees, they were very proud of being Jews. And they were very, very proud of that. And that was something they were going to, their whole center of their life was who they were. And in fact, they even say that, right? That's one of the things that was scared them, I think, about Jesus was that was going to change. That was going to turn them over, right? That was going to change how they were perceived in their role in the Roman society, right? And in their leadership role. What else? Anybody on that one? Okay, in this section we see a glimpse of some of the political social pressure Jesus and his disciples faced. How do these pressures manifest, and how did he and those that believed in him respond? So there's various ways they responded, right? We just talked about the parents, right? I think the parents believed him. What about the blind man himself?
For some, the truth was just so evident
Yeah.
that they were going to believe regardless of the cost.
Yep.
And then there's others who were waiting to see what others would do, especially the leaders
Yeah.
would do.
Yeah.
Because the cost was great.
Yeah.
We talked about India briefly this morning.
Yeah.
Some of those who've responded to the gospel know that they're facing persecution when they respond, after they respond. Some of it could just be like, strange relationships. Some could have their property removed. Some could be killed.
Yeah.
So he said those who respond are in it. They're committed,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
As a result of that.
Yeah. Does it remind you of any of the two of the conversations that Jesus had earlier in the book? Remember the conversation with Nicodemus? We talked about that. Remember he came at night, and we don't see him being outwardly, he's not going around telling people, hey, I believe in this guy, right? We see that later, right? So he doesn't. But then what about the next conversation he has? Remember the next one was with who? The Samaritan woman? And how does she do it? What is her attitude? Everybody said the same thing at the same time. She goes and tells everybody she knows, right? And the context of that is she wasn't very popular. I don't think, she wasn't, she's at the well at the mid part of the day, probably because the other women probably didn't want to be around her, but she went and told everybody she knew. So I think to that point, right, and she was all in from the very beginning, right? She knew, she came in contact with that, came in contact with Jesus, and immediately it lit a fire. Yes, sir.
It's interesting that the thing that's so different among these people is the ability to see the big picture, to get beyond individual factors that were holding the Pharisees from seeing who Jesus was.
Yeah.
Basically, the blind man had no choice. He knew this was true, and he accepted it.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's great. Yes.
Many believe because of her too.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and she had a great impact. And the people that were, and that's a great lesson for us, is when people are very vocal about it. You know, it does. The gospel works, right? And it's, you know, it's not about, you know, who the person is delivering it, but it's about, you know, the fire that the person has and just the desire to teach others. And it is definitely a powerful thing. Yes.
So, I think it's interesting right in that moment in like 27, 26, 23, 29, the dialogue is a little bit more intense. And so a lot of the things are very historical and just an account of this happened, but like the dialogue's fascinating to me, like where they're asking him, he's like, hey, I told you already. He gets very emphatic about it. He's like, I told you what happened here, guys. And he's like, and he answered them, I told you, did you not listen? That's in verse 27. Why do you not want to hear it again? Do you not want to hear it again? You do not want to become his disciples too, do you?
Yeah.
He's like now kind of mocking them.
Yeah.
And like, and it's like, it's fascinating because this guy, I mean, he's been blind his whole life and now he's convinced.
Yeah.
But now he's kind of just throwing it back in their face. And then if you keep reading, well, the intensity kind of got turned up towards him right after that. They were not happy.
Yeah. And they did exactly what the parents knew they were going to do, right? Because it says there in verse 34, they cast him out. And I do believe that's not just throwing him out of that meeting. I think that's the ostracize that they, as society, the Pharisees, I'm done. You move on. You're not one of us. And so, but I think that it is very powerful statements, the things that he says. And, you know, he comes up to verse 33 there. It says, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. And that's what, you know, and then it says they answered him and said, you were completely born in sins and you are teaching us. And then they cast him out. So again, they were just to that point, they just, you know, couldn't see the big picture. They were just so.
Their bias wouldn't let them have the critical thinking to see this point.
Yeah, I think one of the first things I remember years ago is a gentleman, Philip Mullins, is a good gospel preacher that I've known for a long time. And I remember he was when I first started doing studying with people. I was with him and, you know, trying to get better at it and things like that. But I remember that was one of the statements that he would make when he would first start studying with somebody was always just make sure we're both an open book, right? You know, that we're opening this up. We're just going to read what the scriptures say. And let's start with that, you know, kind of that baseline. And if you can start somebody there, then, you know, the rest of it's not easy, but it's just it goes a lot smoother. And I just always thought that was a very simple thing to say, but it was also a very thing so that somebody brought up some past things. Well, wait a minute, the scripture doesn't say that. And we remember we agreed that we were going to do this, or we agreed that we were going to take this as our baseline. So it's a great point, and it is a powerful thing there. All right. So given what we know about the Jewish leaders and their intense focus on ritual cleansing and law keeping, we kind of jumped ahead on this one. It says, and this talks about that. We already really jumped into this one. What is the irony of the formerly blind man's role in this chapter? And it's just, we've already talked about that. It's like, you know, he's all in, as we've said. I mean, he knew what was going on. In 10:6, we are told that Jesus' disciples do not understand Jesus' figure of speech about the shepherd and his sheep at first. What do you think he means in verses 1 through 5? And we talked about this. I talked about that sheepfold, but I'm going to read this and see if folks have more comments about it. It says, most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by his name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, and for they know his voice. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, or will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. So how does this apply to, again, to the Pharisees? Miles doesn't ask that question in this statement. I'm going to ask it, though. You know, what does that say? I mean, if you were one of those Pharisees, what is that saying about them?
They wouldn't believe in him, and so they're just like these sheep they're not true sheep, I guess. They're lost, right? I mean, they're not going by the shepherd's name, or the shepherd's trying to call them, but they're not listening. They're not listening. They think they are. And who do they claim to be children of? I think it's interesting too. Yeah.
Yeah, I always think that's interesting, right? They were just, and it's like, it's like talking about being, who did they claim to be earlier on in chapter 8? Remember who they talked about? Because Jesus calls them out about it. Abraham, right? So they're calling out all the big names, right? I mean, they're calling out all these names from history, like, oh no, we're, and it's something that, I think they obviously take a lot of pride in, but nothing about Moses or nothing about, Abraham is in their character, right? I mean, you don't see anything that they're doing that it would be anything like what those men would have done, right? And the things that they did. All right. It says Jesus' analogy of a shepherd in 7 through 18 helps us understand how does Jesus' analogy as a shepherd, and I think we've talked about this quite a bit already, help us to understand how he views us. How does he view his mission? And we talked about that in that, the physical sheepfold and how that works. But what does Jesus, how does he view his mission? How do we see him?
It's very analogous to the eldership, right?
Yeah.
In fact, the eldership was modeled after the Good Shepherd.
Yeah, we call them shepherds, right? I mean, for a reason, right? I mean, that's just, there's a protective nature that shepherds have to have, elders have to have.
Feed and protect the flock.
Yeah. And I think that's something that is, if you've never done that, if you've never been an elder, you don't appreciate it, I don't think, as much as there's just no way to do it. But if you've ever been an elder and you've been it, I remember the first time I was appointed an elder, one of the gentlemen that I'd known for a long time, he had been an elder, and I was talking to him asking for some advice. And he said, Chuck, the best thing and the worst thing are the same thing. And I was like, what? And he was like, he said, you know things about people in the congregation that nobody else does. And I thought that was a real powerful thing. That stuck with me all these years. And it's true, right? Because the things that people are doing that never take credit for it, who unlocks the building, who cleans the bathrooms, who does, whatever little things need to be done, or who's going to see about somebody, that needs help. And things get done that people never know about. But then there's also that other side that, people are struggling. I say, everybody here this morning, probably, a lot of us are probably, one step away from having some type of, meltdown about something in our lives, whether it be something physical or spiritual or whatever. And it's just, we're here to help each other get through those things. And that's something very powerful. And I think that's something that we just, I don't know. It's just, it's something that, there's just something to be said about that. And I think the shepherds it's a very powerful thing. The analogy there is, like I said, I didn't fully appreciate it till I saw that shepherd in Romania, right, and what he was doing, and the fact he had. But you see that, and the analogy there is powerful. Yes, sir.
It's also a good contrast with the Pharisees who are supposed to be shepherds of people.
Yep.
And they're definitely not. I mean, they're not the good shepherd. They're not laying down their lives.
Yeah.
It's all about them.
Yeah, it's all. Yeah, exactly. I was going to say it's definitely a me thing, me first.
You can see how angry they would have been given everything leading up to this chapter. He's told them, I am, you need to follow me.
Yeah.
In chapter 8, he's told them, you're blind.
Yep.
And he's now telling them, you're bad shepherds.
Yeah.
And he's
Yeah.
really, kind of ratcheting up
Yep.
because their hearts aren't honest.
Yep. Yep. That's a very good point, and I think that's it. And then a very good point. Anything else? Yes.
It's interesting how he's the perfect shepherd in that he can focus at the same time on one sheep, as he does with the Samaritan woman
Yep.
and the blind man. Zoom back out, see the big picture, zoom
Yeah.
back in. Just constantly looking at both the small picture and the big picture
Yeah.
in a perfect way that I think we have trouble with sometimes.
Yeah, I agree, and I think, and that's one thing we talked early on about in the book of in the Gospel of John is all these conversations that he has. A lot of them are, one-on-ones. There's these conversations that he has, but granted, like you said, you take that step back, and it was meant for everybody around him, right? And all the things that the larger audience around him. So, it's a great point. Some have said Jesus was either, and we talked about this one I think last week, a liar, a lunatic, or Lord. What do the disciples and the Jews seem to be thinking about him at this point? And we talked about that earlier, right? What's the extremes that you have? He's either a prophet, he's a teacher, he's the son of God, or he's a demon, right? Or he's from the devil, right? I mean, so you got all extremes, and depending on, and those extremes are based on what? They're based on those individuals, right? it's like the center point is still the same, right? You know, Jesus he's no different, right? I mean, he's still there, right?
Well, it's almost, I see it analogous to like the fact that God created the universe. If you take that out of your mind, if you're these Jews and you take it out of your mind that he could be the Messiah, well, okay, yeah, this makes sense. I mean, he could be a liar, could be a lunatic, but he's still performing these miracles. But, I mean, they're kicking that completely out of their mind as not even an option. And if they do that, well, now they have to fill it in with something else.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. Anything else? Cool. All right. We have seen Jesus participate in several Jewish feasts so far. We talked about this. The Jewish leadership also seems to think that he does not respect the law of Moses. How have his words and actions so far helped us to understand Jesus' view on the old law? How does his respect for the old law affect our view of the Old Testament? This is one of Miles's good questions. There, we've got 3 or 4 in one question there, but it's a good one. But so obviously, I mean, I'm sure from other study, what is he saying about the old law here?
He went to great lengths to honor the old law in all aspects, but he believed that his works and demonstration of the power of the Lord outweighed some rituals and oral traditions that the Jewish leaders had established.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to ask it again this week, see if anybody remembers. What analogy did I use? And now, for the visitors, y'all don't have to answer this, but does anybody remember my analogy I used last week about the old law and their traditions? Huh? Thank you. See, somebody remembered. No, I feel good. No. No, the idea was that I heard this analogy a long time ago. It may not make any sense to anybody else, but the idea was that the old law was a wall around the Jewish people, right? That was their wall. But by the time Jesus came, they had built a hedge. And the hedge had gotten so tall that they no longer looked at the law, they looked at that hedge. And so that, and just that analogy there, that they built their own set of rules and traditions that, had kind of outweighed the law. But Jesus was there to fulfill the law. And also, what do we see about, just the number of times he quotes the old law, right? In the Testaments or in the New Testament. And then over in, even Paul, in the famous passage in 2 Timothy chapter 3, he talks about all scripture is given by inspiration of God and is profitable for doctrine, reproof, for correction, instruction, that the man of God may be thoroughly equipped for all good work. At that time, what would have been the scripture? It would have been the old law, right? So again, we understand that. So.
Matthew 5:17-18. Do not think I've come to abolish law prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them.
Yep.
So I say, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass away from the law until all is accomplished. And he even goes on like a couple verses later. I say, unless your righteousness exceeds that of scribes and Pharisees, but he's coming to fulfill it. He's not coming to abolish it at all. But he's going back to the actual wall and
Yep.
the hedge.
Yep.
Zero patience for that hedge because
Yeah.
that hedge has just become a massive barrier.
Yeah, exactly.
For the people to God, they can't see God because it's
Yep.
stuck in all these traditions.
Yep, a great point. And it just they let all that circumstance and all the things that they had created, like I said, be a barrier to them. So it become, like I said, they looked at it as protection, but it become a barrier to understanding that. All right. So what argument does Jesus make to defend himself in 10:22-38? How does he try, even those trying to kill him, how does he try to help even those trying to kill him understand who he is and what he is doing, and why did they refuse to listen? What's that? They were not the real sheep. I'm going to go ahead and read this. I know it's a kind of lengthy reading, but I think it'll just kind of give us a good kind of do this. And I want to make sure it kind of leads into the last question as well. So I'm going to go ahead and read this. This is now when the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus walked in the temple in Solomon's porch. Then the Jews surrounding him and said to him, "How long do you keep us in doubt? If you are the Christ, tell us plainly." Jesus said, "I told you, and you do not believe. The works that I do in my Father's name, they bear witness of me. But you do not believe because you are not of my sheep. As I said to you, my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And I give them eternal life, and they shall never perish. Neither shall anyone snatch them out of my hand. My Father who has given them to me is greater than all, and no one is able to snatch them out of my Father's hand. I and my Father are one. Then the Jews took up stones again to stone him. Jesus said to them, Many good works I have shown you from my Father. For which of these works do you stone me? Then the Jews answered and said, For a good work we do not stone you, but for blasphemy, and because you, being a man, make yourself God. It is not. Jesus answered them, It is not written in your law. I said, Is it not written in your law? I said, You are gods. And he called them gods to whom the word of God came, and the scripture cannot be broken. Do you say of them whom the Father sanctified and sent into the world, You are blaspheming, because I said, I am the Son of God? If I do not do the works of my Father, do not believe me. But if I do, though you do not believe me, believe the works, that you may know me, that you may know and believe that the Father is in me and I in him. So again, he's drawing that line as clearly as he can right here. And it says, so what is he trying to emphasize to them? Do you think in this section? What is he trying to bring home to them?
You got the evidence.
He's God.
Yeah, you got the evidence. Here it is. I mean, yeah, everything I've been doing for, if his ministry was 3 years, 2.5 years, or 2 years, 9 months at this point, it's all there. You've got every bit of evidence that you should need, right? What else? Anything? I mean, Jim?
It's almost like he's saying, look, take your emotions out of it. Go back to what is written, what you know that you've been studying all these years, and take a look at it objectively. But it's like their emotions are getting involved, saying, oh, he's saying he's the Son of God, and they're getting mad and just forgetting everything they used to know.
Yeah. And do you not see that? It's a great way to put it, Jimmy, as far as, do we not see that today, though, when we study with somebody? It's, we can, and I said that earlier about studying with somebody and be an open book and try to be a clean slate. But people have whatever, we all have it, right? The way I've always heard it said, or I put it, is we all have a certain amount of baggage when we come to Christ, right? And we all, whatever that might be, whether it was a denominational background or whether it was whatever it might be, we're all different, right? And I know Miles, for whatever reasons, he acts a little bit like me sometimes. I remember last time we were together, Claire said something about Miles, something mannerism he had, and I did about the same thing, and she said something like we kind of looked alike or acted alike or something, and Miles didn't look real happy about that, but yeah, it's just, but you do, right? You take on the character traits of your family, you have that identity, right? And that, of that kind of thing. And so I think that's something it's very powerful here. But, he starts there, they aren't, like was mentioned, they're not his sheep. You're not listening because you don't want to hear what I'm saying. And I think that when we talk about that when we study with people today, sometimes we have to break that barrier down as far as, whatever baggage they have. And I think sometimes when people come, and are obeying the gospel or thinking about it, sometimes they, it's good for us to kind of air our past and say, hey, look, we had some baggage too, right? And we still got some, right? We're just trying to, do the best we can with it. But what else? Anything else about, yes?
I have written in my Bible that 20 times he said, I am the Son of God before these verses here.
Okay.
And that reminds me of when they wouldn't believe the blind man. They kept saying, tell us, even though he would tell them over and over again.
Yep.
So it's kind of similar.
Yep. Very much. Yes.
Verse 25, 24, they say, for the Christ tells plainly, they said, I told you, you don't believe the works that I do in my Father's name. These bear witness of me. It's a flashback to what we talked about in chapter 5, where in verse 36, where he had already told him, the works which the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I do, bear witness of me that the Father has sent me. They keep seeing these works over and over again. They keep seeing these miracles. And it's like, it's a constant refusal of letting those show that God sent him.
Yeah.
It attests to it, but it's stubbornness and pride, right?
Yeah.
That they're getting hung up on these other things.
Yeah.
When did he do it though? On the
Yeah.
Sabbath. Okay, that's
Yeah.
what we're going to get hung up on. Not
Yeah.
that he made a blind
Yeah.
right?
That's a good point. That's a good point. And you think too, I mean, and again, not trying to defend their actions at all. I hope it comes out, say this the right way, but it's like they had a picture. I don't know who I heard say this one time, but they had a picture of the Messiah, what they thought was the Messiah. And I guarantee you, they in no way, they thought they were on they were on the fast track, right? People, they thought they had the inroad when he came. And like I said, and Jesus throws them a curve because he's like, man, y'all are so far off the rails, you're just not even close. And I think that's what, part of that is like, man, it's like we're the leaders of the people, and we've got it wrong. And admitting you're wrong sometimes is the hardest thing, right?
Well, sometimes don't you wonder if also who he's healing, sometimes it's not the people they would want him to heal, right?
Yeah,
The
that's true.
He's talking to the Samaritan woman,
Yeah.
heals the blind man who was a beggar.
Yeah.
He's maybe too, it's like he's not performing the miracles on the way they would want him to as
Yeah.
well.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that. Yeah, Tim.
So, I think 26, 27, actually it's in 28. It might make one of my top 10 favorite in all scripture, because when it talks about when he will give eternal life and they'll never perish and no one will snatch them out of my hand.
That's
So
cool.
in the world of broken promises, in the world of where people change things or
Yeah.
don't follow through or whatever, God has promised, and he will protect us. Now, somebody can take our life, but that promise that he has to us of eternal life, no one can ever take that away.
Yeah.
If we choose to be in his fold.
Yep. I think that section reminds me a lot of what Paul says, and I won't read for sake of time this morning, but one of my favorite passages, because we were going through a real rough spot in 96, and a friend of ours, that Philip Mullins, was actually give me a book, and in the front of that book, he wrote Romans 8:31-39. And to me, that's still one of those go-to passages for me if I ever have a rough spot in my life. And you think about that, to that very point, Tim, is that nothing can separate you from God, right? It's all up, unless it's yourself, right? I mean, if you let it happen, it can happen. But as far as being a free moral agent, but to me, it's a great point, Tim. I mean, it's a very powerful point to make. And then the last one here in this lesson is that Jesus has talked at length about beliefs in him and has done good works. How does Jesus' ministry help us understand the balance between faith and our good works? So, I know, well, we got 1 minute left, I know, but
We have a working faith.
yeah.
We need to be obedient, working faith.
Yep. And I think too, what is it? And one other thing I'll say about that is that obedient working faith. But also, when we're doing those things, not everybody's going to like that, right? I mean, and I think we see that with Jesus. Like, he does this, and he's doing everything he can. Obviously, he's perfect in what he's doing, but yet still people are rejecting him, and people will reject us even when we're doing the right thing. And I think that's another powerful part of that. So anyways, I know we got a lot of visitors here in the morning, so we'll probably be fighting over spaces out there. So we'll get out of here a little bit early. So no, I'm just kidding. But no, I appreciate everybody being here. Appreciate all the comments. And thank y'all very much for everything. So.
So we're from Indiana.
Huh?
We're from Indiana.
Oh,